Hey guys, Eric Smith here, Five Reasons Sports contributor, also co host of Scouting the Fins. It's been almost a month since I posted my last video, and that break was to get prepared for the NFL draft. And here we are, the morning after round one, and we've dug into a bunch of the film, and it's time to get into a full player breakdown for the newest Miami Dolphin, 13th overall pick in the 2025 NFL draft, Kenneth Grant. So Grant is a massive player, right? He stands at 6'3" and a half, 330 pounds, which I think is really a sweet spot for a nose tackle type player, which is how I view Kenneth Grant. He's not a 6'1" guy that is going to struggle with length in the middle, but he's also not that Raekwon Davis, 6'6", 6'7" guy that's going to struggle with leverage. So I think that if you were to build a nose tackle type player in a lab, he would look a lot like Kenneth Grant does. He actually played 546 snaps in 2024, and that was very comparable to his teammate Mason Graham, who went in the top 5 of the draft. 329 of those snaps were in the passing game, which was obviously over half. I think that when we look at the NFL contributions from Kenneth Grant, I think we might see that flipped a little bit where, more of the snaps are going to be in more competitive games than what Michigan may have been playing in, and more of those snaps may be in the running game. Grant gained a lot of attention with the viral video of him chasing down Penn State's running back in the open field, but this guy is really so much more. I personally had him as the number 3 tackle on my draft board. So I had him behind Mason Graham, who was a legitimate top 5 talent. Didn't really understand the talk about him possibly falling in the draft that we heard leading up to last night's round one. And the other player that I had ahead of Kenneth Grant was Tyleik Williams out of Ohio State. And that was more of a target at 48. I really expected there to be some good options at 48. Williams ended up going number 28 to the Lions. And the main reason that I had Tyleik Williams higher than Grant on my board was just a little more alignment versatility. Thought that he could kick out to a 4 or 5 technique a little better than what Grant could, but that's clearly not what the Dolphins were looking for to bolster this defense. And I can see the vision with plopping Kenneth Grant in the middle of this defense and, watching him just eat up blocks and dominate and open things up for other players. I do view him as more of a 0 or 1 technique, but Travis Wingfield shared that Kenneth Grant was a 3 technique on 386 of his snaps in 2024, and only 170 is a more traditional nose. Again, that's something I see changing a little bit in the NFL with Zach Sealer playing beside him, but speaks a lot to his versatility that he's not just that that massive slug in the middle, the Benito Jones type that is really restricted to a 0-1 technique. He's got a lot more value than that. So with all that said, let's dive into some more specific aspects of Kenneth Grant's film. All right, so the first thing we're going to play here is Kenneth Grant's ability to take on double teams. So the ability to take on a double team is what's going to allow a team to stay in a base defense or a too-high shell and still be able to shut down the running game. And that's how you earn second or third and long scenarios where the pass rushers can really, get into a one-track mindset like the Eagles did versus the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, where they can really pin their ears back and get after the quarterback. Think of a Jalen Carter type of player in the middle of the defense. So when we talk about Kenneth Grant specifically, and you can see in these clips, like you're rarely seeing him lose any ground vertically despite taking on 2 blockers. And when he's either occupying those 2 linemen the entire play, or he's doing it at least long enough for the linebacker to fill up the line of scrimmage rather than having to negotiate a block at the second level. This type of thing is going to clog up the middle of the field, and it's going to force plays to bounce wider than they were intended. So when we look at Grant's impact on the defense, like this is something he's going to do day one and do it effectively. His ability to take on double teams is going to open things up for someone like Zach Sealer on the other side, because you can't double both defensive tackles most of the time in the NFL. So one of these guys is going to get one-on-one blocks, and when Kenneth Grant is earning those double team blocks, it's going to be Sealer who's going to feast, and we've seen him do that over and over again when he's got partners like Calais Campbell and Christian Wilkins beside him. And I think Kenneth Grant is going to be the next in a line of very good partners for Zach Sealer. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is Grant's ability to stack and shed in the run game. So, we just talked about double teams, but, once they do that for a while and Zach Sealer is the one who's making the plays, then they're going to start doubling Zach Sealer. And that's where Kenneth Grant is going to need to be able to, earn his living, being able to defeat one-on-one blocks when you get them. You see in these clips that he's repeatedly able to jam, extend, and shed to make plays. He's able to move down the line of scrimmage without losing ground. And that's a key thing to be able to do in the zone running plays, especially those wide zone runs that have become more widespread as the Kyle Shanahan tree branches out. You can see his ability that, even when a block appears to be heading towards a stalemate, that Grant's able to either shed the block or he's able to continue to change the line of scrimmage and drive the offensive lineman into the play. So, definitely an area that not a one-man show, right? Not going to, just wreck everything every play. But when you can go from a player who can handle those double teams and clog it up in the middle and then be able to take advantage of the one-on-one blocking when that opportunity presents itself, that's a different skill set that not everybody has. All right, getting into some of the passing game stuff for Kenneth Grant. The next thing we're going to look at is his ability to dent or push the pocket. And you'll see Grant spending a lot of times letting other players feast, and he's kind of sitting back in almost a spy technique. And I'm not sure if that was by design with Michigan's defense, considering what they had around Grant, or just, the way that Grant plays. But you can see in these clips that when he wants to get vertical with his pass rush, he does a good job of affecting the play. And you're not going to see this turn into a ton of sacks for Grant, right? But when you picture the pocket the way that guys like Bradley Chubb, Jalen Phillips, Chop Robinson, and even throw Willie Gay Jr. in there, they're all going to come hot off the corner, and they're going to force the quarterback to step up in the pocket. And, if we go back to the Cameron Wake days, we've seen how frustrating that can be when your edge players are winning off the corner, but the quarterback simply steps up into a clean pocket and still is able to make the throw. A player like Grant goes a long way to filling that void. He's able to push the pocket to where the quarterback's options become limited, where he can either stay at the top of the pocket and get sacked, or he can step up into the pocket where Grant has muddied the space available. And that, could end up with an errant pass, could end up with him still getting sacked, right? Lots of good things that can happen. But again, this is the type of stuff that can be seen when you go back and you watch a lot of the reps for Kenneth Grant, but it's not the type of stuff that's going to really show up on the box score. So again, right, not going to post the 10 or 12 sack seasons, right? But this is the type of player, the complementary piece as a pass rusher, that could end up with your edge guys, your Chubb, your Chop, your Phillips, maybe even a Sealer, right? We could see multiple of those guys ending up as double-digit sack guys just with the extra opportunities that Grant can produce by pushing the middle of the pocket. All right, so we have talked about double teams, we've talked about stack and shed, and we've talked about denting the pocket in the passing game. And those are all highly physical plays with an athletic 330-pound monster ramming into you. So now we're going to look at some plays where Grant is able to use his athleticism to slice into the backfield and make plays. Most offensive linemen, whether you're talking college or NFL, can't hold up to that every play without sacrificing something. You have to sink your feet into the ground and set your anchor, where you risk getting humiliated as Grant blows up the play in the backfield. The reward for Kenneth Grant is that while he might not be a Christian Wilkins when it comes to his ability to use quickness and defeat blocks, you can pick and choose some times where you expose an offensive lineman who is getting too heavy in his sets. And when you do that, you end up making the offensive lineman look silly, right? And we see that in these clips. And like I said, this isn't something that Grant is going to show up and do play in and play out, but the way that he is able to set this up with his strength and his explosion, right, is going to provide a few opportunities every game where you'll see him making these type of plays, and they don't always result in tackles, right? Maybe it results in a running back that has to avoid him in the open field, but it's going to completely destroy the structure of a play. So definitely another strength here for Grant that, we look at him as a nose. You're not going to see a Benito Jones doing this type of stuff. This is that next level that a elite athlete at the position provides for the defense. All right, next let's talk about Grant's pursuit. When you watch this guy coming off the bus, you picture a between the tackles, two-gap run stuffer, but you'd probably never classify him as a sideline-to-sideline player. You saw in the viral Penn State clip that he's capable of so much more. And it's not just that play. You see it in every game. As a 0 or 1 technique player, he's able to get outside the box, right, and pursue all the way to the sideline. We talked earlier about his pass rush strategy and how he sometimes seems to play more of a spy technique. And you see some of that in these clips, and also why it may have been part of the defensive scheme. He's surprisingly good at it for his size. And if he's not getting to the quarterback, he's not just giving up on the play. He's pursuing the width of the field and still making plays. When you're playing the likes of Josh Allen, Justin Fields, and even Drake May in the AFC East, you have to be able to get bodies around a mobile quarterback, and you can't afford to just accept a player is no longer in the play once those quarterbacks inevitably extend the plays and get out of the pocket throughout the season. All right, we're going to spend a little bit of time here on negatives or room to improve reps. Kenneth Grant is not a perfect player. If he was, he'd have gone even higher than Mason Graham because Grant has a higher athletic ceiling than what Graham does. And the things we're going to look at here are to show that there is room for improvement for Grant, but none of them are even close to showstoppers. He's got elite first step quickness. But if he's selling out for a quickness move and doesn't hit on it, then he can put himself into vulnerable positions where he's too high to reset his anchor, and that causes him to, get displaced horizontally when, his pads are too high and the offensive lineman is able to get leverage on him. But these reps are far and few between, and they do exist, but they're also fairly easy to cut out of his game, especially if he continues to show a good understanding of when it's worth it to take those risks of those quickness moves versus the power, and when he should be playing it more straight up. And, it's worth noting that any defensive tackle who makes some of those splash plays where they leave offensive linemen grasping at air, they're going to put a few of these reps on tape too. So this isn't uncommon for a player like Grant, but still something that he can continue to, try to minimalize as he works through his NFL career. And then the last thing we're going to look at for the film review is Kenneth Grant's lack of a counter or a secondary move as a pass rusher. He's explosive off the snap, and he has plenty of reps where that's good enough to impact the passing game. But if he's going to take the next steps towards a all-pro level interior defensive lineman, an area that has a lot of room to improve is how he reacts when his initial pass rush move isn't there. This is a great opportunity for Zach Sealer and also Austin Clark to share some knowledge with Grant and see growth early in his career. And if Kenneth Grant can figure out a way to take a few of these reps where he's okay, but not quite affecting the quarterback, and add a counter move that helps him get that step or two closer, then we could really see that 8 to 10 sack, interior player. Okay, so now that we're done with the film review, what do I like, right? So at the top is the interior anchor. You rarely see Kenneth Grant going backwards. And then the stack and shed against one-on-one blocks, when he's playing discipline. We talked about him getting a little high, but, if Sealer is getting the double team and Grant is getting that one-on-one block, then I like his chances to win versus most offensive linemen. Like the way that he pushes the pocket as an interior pass rusher, like the way that he hustles the plays even when, he's not involved with it early. He's playing to the whistle. He is a elite athlete for his size. We saw him used on a lot of interior stunts with Mason Graham, and that's something that Zach Sealer has really done well with both Christian Wilkins and Calais Campbell. So I would expect that, to continue to have good chemistry as Kenneth Grant gets into the lineup as well. I'm talking about his elite athleticism. At his pro day, he ran a 1.72 10-yard split. And, we talk about athleticism on the offensive side of the ball when it comes to a Kyle Shanahan or Mike McDaniel offense. That 1.72 is just as good as any offensive lineman that's been drafted by either of those two guys. And, the big thing with Kenneth Grant for me is that he does a lot of stuff that's not going to show up on the stat sheet. So what don't I like? I think that he is limited to a 0 to 3 technique defensive tackle. Again, we're doing this the day after the draft, so there is still a void for somebody else that can play that 4 and 5 technique, and maybe it's somebody like Emmanuel Ogbah coming back to the team. So, like I talked about at the top, had Tyleik Williams rated a little higher on my board just because of his ability to play a little wider in the alignments. But Kenneth Grant was the best, interior, the true 0 to 3 technique tackle in this draft. So, going to wait to see how this plays out, but so far is looking pretty good. The counters for the pass rush moves, we talked about that. Too often is kind of a one-trick pony as a pass rusher. So need to see him continue to improve on that to really, go to the next level. And then, the playing it high, some of that has to do with guessing, right? Putting himself in vulnerable situations, which allows him to get, moved side to side a little more than you want. Again, one of those things that you can continue to develop. You can pick and choose when you do that so that, if you do that and it doesn't work out, you're not doing it in a key 3rd and 1 situation. But again, something that can continue to improve as he works through his NFL career. And then the last thing on him, kind of expected for a guy his size, is that, he wears down kind of quickly, especially when an offense is moving fast, right? If you're in a no huddle situation or some of these fast-paced offenses we see in college, you can kind of see, I don't want to call it laziness because he has a lot of really good hustle plays, but you can see a difference in his play. And the, positive when you're looking at that is that very few NFL teams operate out of a no-huddle offense on a regular basis. So, I think that's something that, even though it's worth noting, is probably not going to be something that pops up a lot in the NFL. And when this pick was made, I was not thrilled with the pick, but I liked it a lot more by the end of the night. When you look at the run that happened on defensive tackles in the first round, you had, essentially 5 of them going, or no, 6. You had Mason Graham going at 4 to the Patriots. You had Mykel Williams, who some list as an edge. I see more as a 5 technique player, so I would include him as an interior defensive line. You had Walter Nolan going at 16 to the Cardinals. You had Harmon being a bit of a surprise going to the Steelers at 21. And then, like we mentioned, Tyleik Williams going to number 28 to the Lions. And, looking at my draft strategy, originally I wanted to get a defensive back at 13, specifically Jahdae Barron, and then circle back at 48 to pick one of these defensive tackles who I felt, were. I thought we'd have some good options at 48. But as I look back over my draft board and I look at that list of, 6 or 7 defensive tackles that I had, that I, still felt comfortable being able to step in beside Zach Sealer and, be a 500 to 600 snap player. The only one that's really left is Alfred Collins. And with our pick not being until 48, there's no guarantee that Collins is on the board then either, right? So as we look back at how this played out, I think that Chris Grier deserves credit because heading into the draft, only having Zach Sealer, Benito Jones, and then a couple of fringe 53 players, you absolutely had to add another high snap defensive lineman in this draft. And if he had gone with Jahdae Barron at 13 and then we got to 48 and every single one of these guys were off the board, then it would look like a really bad decision. But that's not the way it's played out. Instead, we've seen the run on defensive tackles. And as we head into day 2 of the draft, there's still a lot of good cornerbacks on the board. So interested to see how this continues to play out, but this is a pick that I liked, right? Didn't love when it happened, but the further we get away from pick 13, the more that I really do love this pick. Adding something that the defensive line really needs, the team overall. I think that he is going to set the table for some of the other guys, the more high sack guys. I think really going to benefit those guys more than what the box score is going to show. So as we get into day 2 and 3 of the draft, probably going to have some more breakdowns and film review of these players. I appreciate you guys watching, and we'll talk again soon.